I'm going to be talking about Faerie, which is basically cognate with enchantment. And part of what I want to establish is quite a sharp distinction between enchantment and magic as being two very different things. And so in a way that I hope will become clear, I'm not talking about magic, I'm talking about enchantment. And so how I want to proceed is, I want to give you some sort of pointers about enchantment. Then I want to look at enchantment in the work of Tolkien and Lewis, as how does enchantment, what are the issues around enchantment in this literary corner of the broader cultural field, which is itself a corner of our lives as a whole, okay? And then I want to look at the same issues which play out in a very different way in the work of Philip Pullman. And then lastly, I want to come back to the last term in my title, Hypermodernity, and ask, what is the future, so to speak, of enchantment in a hypermodern world? All in half an hour. So here we are. So there's an 18th century Scottish ballad called Thomas the Rhymer, which Tolkien quotes at the beginning of his marvelous essay on fairy stories, and if you haven't read it, I highly, highly recommend it. To save time, I won't read the ballad out to you, but basically, our hero, a young man, is abducted, it has to be said without too much of a struggle, by the Queen of Elfland, and who carries him off on her white horse. And they pass a road. He says, "Where does that go?" And she says, "Oh, that's the road to heaven." And then they pass a different one. He says, "Where does that go?" That's the road to hell. But we're bound for the third road, the road to Elfland. And I want to take this as a sort of guiding metaphor, okay, for what I have to say. The view of Faerie as neither quite heaven nor hell, but deeply ambiguous, theologically at any rate ambiguous, is quite an old one. The natives of Faerie, C.S. Lewis remarked, are, quote, "are marginal fugitive creatures. They are perhaps the only creatures to whom the model, with a capital M, does not assign, as it were, an official status," end quote. Now, just because this road or this place is wild in this way, and unbiddable, to borrow a word from a friend, a very useful word, it's really consistently discouraged and marginalized by every official program, religious or secular, with a model, okay? So it really remains the road less traveled, or at least I think it's more a case of less reported. I think we all travel it a lot, but we don't always talk about it. For fear of what others might think, or indeed what we might think of ourselves. I think enchantment continues to entice and fascinate and play a big role in our lives. So the question then arises, what is the consequence, what happens when these two demands conflict? The demand for security and order within the remit of a model, and on the other hand, the demand for enchantment, so that your life is not simply disenchanted, or in that sense, sort of barren or meaningless. So perhaps if I can, before I turn to Tolkien and Lewis, I want to give you a better idea of what I mean by enchantment, okay? I consider these, what follows, as sort of field marks, the way bird watchers would say, "Oh, well, it had a red mark on its head and it had yellow feet, so it's probably this." So what are some field marks for enchantment when you encounter it, or Faerie, if you find yourself there? First of all, I want to say no hard and fast distinction is possible between your state of mind, or your condition, and the world, okay? Faerie completely disregards all that Cartesian and for that matter earlier Christian Platonic training to make this sharp distinction between, oh, your state of mind is this, but the world is that. No, it's both, okay? It's both or it's neither, Okay, so if you're in an enchanted condition, you're in an enchanted world, and vice versa. Now, Tolkien is an authority. There's no doubt about it. There aren't many, by the way, of people who've actually written with depth and precision and learning on enchantment, and Tolkien is one. And in his essay on fairy stories, he defines the primal desire at the heart of fairy as, quote, the realization, independent of the conceiving mind, it doesn't depend on cognition, of imagined wonder. You know, that is such a rich definition. I'm not going to try and unpack it for you. You'll have to work on that yourself if you want to. Just buy the essay and read it and think about it. But realization in the sense of wonder, something that you only perhaps ever imagined coming real. You actually meet this person. You never imagined that they actually existed or that it was possible to meet them, etc. Okay? The contrast that he draws is between enchantment and magic. And he says, magic is not an art, but a technique, and its desire is power. In this world, domination of things and wills. Now, it may be the case that magic uses supernatural or spiritual means to make things happen in this world, but that's not an important distinction. And what this definition of magic means is that technoscience is our magic. It's modern magic, okay? It's interested in dominating and changing and moving things and remaking the world, okay? That's magic. So the two hallmarks, respectively, are of magic, will, and of enchantment, wonder. With enchantment, there's absolutely no interest in making anything happen, or indeed in even doing anything. You are in a state of wonder. You're in a relationship that entails a state of wonder. Now, another authority we should listen to is Max Weber, who defined enchantment as concrete magic, and by magic he means wonder. Okay? This is very important. Enchantment is always both material and spiritual. It always involves a very precise set of circumstances. This room, this piece of music, this person, this flower, whatever. Very precise and deeply, deeply mysterious and ineffable at the same time. Okay? That's one reason why religion regards enchantment with suspicion, because it wants your spiritual experience to be entirely spiritual, transcend the material, leave the world behind, the mere earthly plane, all that jazz, right? Enchantment doesn't do that. It's both simultaneously spiritual and material. Very important. The contrast Weber draws is between enchantment and, quote, rational cognition and mastery of nature. And the program for rational mastery of nature results in, he said, the disenchantment of the world. Okay? Now, a third way to look at it is to approach enchantment through its etymology, coming to us from the French enchanté, itself from the Latin incantare, to be in, cantare, to sing. And I interpret this to mean enchantment is the experience of finding yourself in a song, or more broadly, in a narrative, in a story, okay? You finding yourself in a song you were hearing, or it could be a song you were singing, or it could be a book you're reading, finding yourself in the book you're reading. This is an experience of enchantment, okay? There's other signs. The way Coleridge describes Kubla Khan, flashing eyes and floating hair. If you meet somebody with flashing eyes and floating hair, that's always a giveaway. And time slowing right down. That's another little sign, okay? Right, the three roads. Let's look at that for a minute. First, note that heaven and hell are codependent. Because the model is a singular model. There's not more than one model. There's only one model with a capital M allowed. Heaven and hell are different parts of it. The name of the model as a whole, if it's religious, might be God. Okay? So there's actually only, heaven and hell, different aspects of the same road. And they're not radical alternatives to each other. Right? Enchantment is the radical alternative to either of them, or both of them. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip my... I'll just say, the model requires monism, a single principle. In theology, it's God. In science, it's truth with a capital T, or laws of nature, or whatever. But there can be only a single principle in relation to which everything can be ordered, okay? Because if you have more than one principle that's bedrock, then you may have two truths with no way to judge between them. Well, that's completely unacceptable to the officials, okay, enforcing the model. You have to have a single principle. So pluralism, messy, inconsistent, agonistic pluralism is the alternative, is the only alternative to the monism of the model. Okay, in animism, polytheism, and pluralism, secular pluralism, it's openly a mess. Okay, I mean that's one way to describe it. Anyway, ongoing, confusing, struggling, etc. Right? That's what the model wants to eliminate in the interests of knowledge, control, order, security, etc. It follows that the roots of disenchantment lie in religion, or specifically in Abrahamic monotheistic religions. Okay? Adorno and Horkheimer, who followed very closely in Max Weber's footsteps, saw this very clearly. Quote, "Reason and religion deprecate and condemn the principle of enchantment. The break between theism and secular rational modernism is not a radical one. God gets replaced by truth. Revelation gets replaced by scientific reason. Theologians are replaced by scientists, the proverbial men in white coats. And the nature of heresy changes. But the fundamental logic doesn't change. It's a monist logic. And interestingly, both programs use the word superstition to condemn what they don't like. In religious context, superstition is illicit religion. In scientific terms, superstition is scientific ignorance. Okay, so there's no fundamental change there. Okay, and they both have enormous problems with, as superstition, enchantment. Because superstition is basically unlicensed enchantment. It's enchantment that we're not in charge of, so it's unacceptable. Okay. Now. Right. I'm going to turn to Tolkien and Lewis. Moving right on. Obviously, for Tolkien and Lewis, both religion and enchantment are very important. They're both religious men, and they both have very deep personal involvements with enchantment and with Faerie. Okay. How do they work out this potential conflict? Okay. Tolkien, as a staunch Roman Catholic, went farther than you might expect. For example, a reader wrote to him saying that he, Tolkien, had overstepped the mark theologically by having the elves reincarnate. And Tolkien wrote back saying, "I'm sorry, nobody can possibly deny the possibility of reincarnation, even in the primary world or the real world." So he was willing to go pretty far. I think it's relevant that Catholicism is more roomy than Protestantism. It has room for multiple deities that are unacceptable in Protestant terms because they smack of pagan idolatry. So if I'm right about that, this conflict posed a sharper problem for Lewis than it did for Tolkien. They were both supported by the Romantic tradition, the literary English Romantic tradition. But now, really, I'm not that interested in the sort of like influences, literary influences. I'm more interested in what the effects on the readers are of these two, the presence of both religion and enchantment in the books that readers are reading. That's what interests me more. The reading public. Frankly, it doesn't seem to have been a big problem for any readers. How many readers rejected Tolkien's work because it was either pagan or because it was Christian? A pretty small minority, I think. Okay. Now, there are modernist readers who reject Tolkien in exactly the way that Gollum reacted to tasting lembas, the nourishing elvish whey bread. "Ach, no, you try to choke poor Smeagol, dust and ashes, he can't eat that." But that's a particular problem for those people, which I'm going to set to one side. Laura Miller wrote an interesting book a couple of years ago, interesting work called The Magician's Book, A Skeptic's Adventures in Narnia. an American literary critic, in which she basically said, I loved the Narnia books as a child. Then I grew up and became rational, skeptical atheist and rejected all that. And now I'm old enough to ask myself, can I go back and read those books and recapture the enchantment I felt when I read them as a child? And she did, to her credit. So why isn't there a problem, more of a problem for readers here? Okay, I think the answer is threefold. First of all, technically, there's a theological understanding, which is a very minority one and unorthodox, of God and Faerie as sharing some key properties: existential wonder, unbiddability, you can't really tell God what to do, participation in a divine narrative, etc. Okay, but I think that's pretty arcane. Secondly, people have an amazing ability to accommodate two or more formally contradictory views at the same time. Countless polls confirm that most voters want lower taxes and better public services at the same time, please. That's just a human ability. The whole enterprise of theodicy is based upon reconciling a beneficent and all-powerful God with a world riven with suffering, injustice, and stupidity. And apparently they have some success, whatever that exactly means. But the third reason is the most interesting one, and that's to do with the power of enchantment. There's a lovely story in Miller's book in which Tolkien asks Lewis rhetorically, quote, "What class of men would you expect to be most preoccupied with the idea of escape and most hostile to the idea of escape, as in escapism?" The answer, of course, is jailers. Quite right, too. Then she adds, quote, "I too longed for escape, but as I saw it, Christianity was one of the jailers." In other words, the power of narrative as a portal into enchantment is such that when the enchantment works, the wonder that it evokes, being wild and unbiddable, escapes even the intentions of its creators, in this case, Tolkien, or rather Lewis, as a Christian. Okay? Doesn't matter. Let alone, people who try to manage or administer enchantment. We'll come to that at the end. But no, enchantment just can't be controlled in that way. Okay? What about the avowed atheists, modernists, followers of scientism? I tried to come up with a word for followers of scientism. All I come up with is scientoids. What about them in relation to this? Okay, can they do without enchantment? Because they're all very keen on disenchantment. No, I don't believe so. In Tolkien's words, enchantment is, quote, "as necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human as sunlight is for physical life," end quote. So what happens? Well, what happens, I think, is that since modernism demands the consistent worship of unstoppable universal progress, as Robert Musil once, the Austrian novelist, once said, progress is wonderful if only it would stop. So really, that only leaves for these people, the only kind of enchantment that leaves is inadmissible, illicit, preferably unconscious enchantment, which of course makes the enchantment quite dangerous. Okay, you're not supposed to know what's going on. It's sort of schizophrenic, and that's the irony, of course, of rationalism pushed too far. It eliminates its own. It eliminates the ability to reason when you need it most, which is when you're in a non-rational situation or context. In any case, these people are a small minority as well, and most of us manage to muddle along in more or less contextual, more relative ways, which keep a third road to enchantment open, so to speak, or openly open. Right, Pullman. Very interesting instance of these issues. He's a sworn atheist. He's a close friend and supporter of Richard Dawkins. Dawkins is the professor who is planning, did you know this, to devote his immediate retirement to producing children's fairy tales with a scientific basis. Now, Pullman hates the Narnia books, okay? He has enormous issues with Lewis's Narnia books. He's called them, these are all quotes, poisonous, morally squalid, and racist, misogynist, and reactionary. Seems to cover all the bases. So, he also dislikes Tolkien's work, but he doesn't actually get Tolkien. I'm basing what I'm saying now on a correspondence I had with him in the year 2000. He dislikes Tolkien's work on account of the fact that that Tolkien himself was a Catholic. He doesn't like Tolkien's occasionally archaic literary style, and, get this, okay, his biggest problem is that Middle-earth is wholly imaginary and never actually existed. Couldn't make it up. I've got it in black and white, okay? But doesn't Pullman write fiction? And furthermore, doesn't he write fantasy? Okay? So I suggested this to him. He said, well, I'm summarizing, but I write fantasy because I have to. I really don't like it. I'd rather write like George Eliot. Anyway, as Terry Pratchett remarked once when J.K. Rowling denied writing fantasy, I'd have thought the wizards, witches, trolls, unicorns, hidden worlds, and spells would have given her a clue. So he indulges in these extraordinary contortions, attempting to accommodate, you see, his version of the model, which is not religious, but which is secular, and enchantment, which is present in his books, okay, in the Dark Materials. Of course, his Dark Materials, his main work, has enchanted many readers. But it's interesting to note, though, even within Pullman's work, his programmatic dislike of religion in general, and clericalism in particular, his hatred of it, really. It's interesting to see, I don't think I'm the only reader to have noted this, how it gains the upper hand gradually throughout the course of the book over his desire to tell a story, okay? And his ability to tell a story, or rather, get out of the way with your personal opinions and let the story tell itself, okay? Which is the key, right, to writing enchanting stories, I think. And there is a falling off in quality as the 3 volumes progress. And the irony, of course, is it ends up with this sort of windy diatribes against the church. Sorry, he doesn't call it the church. What does he call it? I can't remember. He's got
Magisterium?
Thank you. Yeah, by the end. And it's the same didacticism that spoiled Lewis's last book, The Last Battle, where you're suddenly told, oh, this has all been going on in this, battle of the final battle, and the characters are already all dead, and what? So he's fallen in the same trap that Lewis fell into, basically. There's an Irish poet, Michael Longley, who once said of poetry, but it's very much more widely applicable. When you capture something with precision, you also release its mysterious aura. You don't get the mystery without the precision. That's concrete magic, okay, at work, okay, or enchantment. His Dark Materials starts out with a girl in a cupboard overhearing a disturbing conversation in a very richly imagined and precisely described parallel Oxford. And it ends up with these metaphysical denunciations of the church, together with Will and Lyra's separation, which I think is extremely overwrought, okay. Pullman seems determined to show, and this is something that someone said about Edmund Wilson, who was another great enemy of Tolkien's work, that he is the adult in the room. Tolkien thought that great fairy stories end with, quote, a sudden joyous turn, which rends the story and lets a gleam come through, okay? And Tolkien called what this turn conveys, and that is an extraordinary expression, I think, conveys the measure of Tolkien's understanding. He called what this turn conveys hope without guarantees. It gives people hope, but there's no guarantees. Even as a Christian, on this side of the grave, there is no guarantee of salvation, he said. Okay? In the end, what Pullman gives us is the opposite. Guarantees without hope. And this decision of his is ideologically driven, but it's a failure of art, really. Now, God, I'm blindingly on time. Right, good. Hypermodernity. I used to think that postmodernity, not defined as a historical period, but as a kind of sensibility, had the potential to liberate us from modernity's obsession with progress and enable us, incidentally, to appreciate anti-modernists like Tolkien. Tolkien wasn't a postmodernist, but he certainly was an anti-modernist. Of course, I'm afraid it hasn't quite worked out like that. What basically has happened is that while modernity has lost a good deal of its legitimacy, its popular legitimacy, in the West, not in China. It's on the upswings now in China. The modernist mega machine has nevertheless kept right on going. In fact, it's picking up speed. In this respect, nothing has changed since Max Weber remarked in 1899 that, quote, one has the impression of sitting on a speeding train while doubting whether the next switch will be correctly set. This situation has left what remains of progressive resistance in uncomfortably paradoxical positions, such as hoping for an ecological collapse, bad enough to halt the mega machine, since nothing else seems likely to, but not too bad. So I don't want my people to get hurt, and I hope the animals will be okay. Anyway, I have no solution to that, but I do think the word postmodern should be quietly dropped in favor of hypermodernity, because that reminds us that it's still going, and it's an ugly word, which is a good thing in this context, because it's an ugly phenomenon. At the same time, it's important not to attribute even more powers to the disenchanted and disenchanters, the magicians, who seem to be running the show, the G7, the World Bank, etc., etc. This was one of the messages of Bruno Latour's remarkable little book, We Have Never Been Modern. What he meant was, nobody's ever been completely modern, which in this context is the same thing as saying, nobody is completely disenchanted. It's impossible, unless you're psychotic, to be completely disenchanted, as a human being. In lived life and practice, we cannot live in a completely disenchanted way. So, how do I read this riddle of both enchantment and disenchantment simultaneously taking place, as I think they clearly are? In two ways. One, very simply, enchantment will survive. Like the earth, which I believe is the ultimate source of enchantment. There's nowhere can establish that claim now, but it's something I would like to try and do. Like the earth, enchantment does not need us, but we need it. So it will continue to animate unpredictably and uncontrollably our relationships with each other, with other animals, with nature, with places, with art, with food, etc. Okay? However, turning to disenchantment, insofar as enchantment is, and I insist on this point, unbiddable, cannot be mastered, managed, controlled, sold, etc., or exploited for any purpose of programming, not even good ones. There's not many academics working in this area, but the few academics who pay attention, like Jane Bennett, to enchantment, they just can't get rid of the desire to put it to work for good purposes. Ain't gonna work. So we need another term for the different phenomenon, which is apparently very like enchantment, but is actually driven by disenchantment, which is at the heart of the billion-pound hypermodern industries of advertising, especially advertising, public opinion manipulation, entertainment, political spin, much of the fashion industry, etc. This is not enchantment. This is its wraith-like simulacrum, which can be controlled. Let's call it glamour. Okay? Glamour is actually one of the chief tools in the armory of magic, of the disenchanting magic. Okay? In the sense that Tolkien defines magic. Basically, Foucault's power knowledge, same thing. And it bears the same, glamour bears the same relationship to enchantment as the ring wraiths of Tolkien's world, who merely go on living forever because they cannot die, do to genuine immortality. Tolkien defined how the ring wraiths live as endless serial living. You can't die, you just go on and on and on. He said, not immortality. If there is any immortality, it's on the other side of death. You have to go through death. Okay? Not what people want to hear as a rule. So my second conclusion, my first conclusion was that enchantment will survive, but it coexists with this other phenomenon, okay, that I'm going to call glamour. So my final conclusion about this is that given our susceptibility to promises and systems of promises to completely satisfy our endless desires, especially our desire for security and control, glamour is going to continue too. So what we have then, in contrast to Weber's pronouncement that the fate of modern times is the disenchantment of the world, I'd like to slightly correct him and say our fate is both enchantment and disenchantment in weird tandem, not only one or the other. That's our